Recently, Sony has been trying to push new products into its gaming division, and those are in the form of director's cuts for existing games. And I think it's an interesting idea. By no means is this the first time that we've seen a director's cut for a video game, but this does feel like the first time a major publisher is trying to streamline video game director's cuts into being commonplace for the industry. It's pretty rare, in fact, to see a director's cut for a video game, but Sony has now announced two, one for Death Stranding, one for Ghost of Tsushima, and I also think that one for The Last of Us is inbound, that Last of Us remake that has been in talks to be over at Naughty Dog. I think that beyond just being a remake, they've discussed how it will expand upon the story of the first game. It will introduce new content. So I would not be surprised in the least if Sony also pushes this as the director's cut of The Last of Us. But before I break down my thoughts too much on these products and where I think that some dangers potentially lie for consumers, I'd like to break down what they actually are, because I feel like the term director's cut is a little bit of a misnomer when it comes to what these products actually are. And a lot of the directors of the games themselves, such as Hideo Kojima, would actually agree. In fact, they've said as much. When these director's cuts were first announced, I interpreted that it would basically be the same as a director's cut in a film. So I assumed that there would be cut scenes and gameplay and content that had potentially been cut from the original release that would be reintroduced here. And I do know that basically every game has a whole slew of cut content, whether it's because they ran out of time to develop it, or because it just wasn't quite meshing with the vision of the original release, or for whatever reason, sometimes it's technological restraints. But ultimately, I thought that these director's cuts were going to allow the game directors and the game companies to polish up some of this content and reintroduce it. So this would add content to a lot of main campaigns. It could potentially add story beats and characters and gameplay that just was non-existent in the original game. And it doesn't appear that that's actually what these are. I think that a better term for these, or a better way to understand what they are, would be to refer to them as remasters bundled with DLC. I could be wrong to an extent, but it sounds like, for example, with the Ghost of Tsushima director's cut, the additional content isn't part of necessarily the main campaign, but instead is an add-on. Virtually, like I mentioned, a DLC, and of course we're seeing some graphical enhancements and some slightly more polished gameplay. I do think that in the future, for example with The Last of Us, that won't be the case as much, and we will see something that is perhaps more traditional to the term director's cut, where there will be segments of the game that were not in the original version that will be reintroduced. So I do think that it's kind of like a remake, where it's going to depend upon the title, and it's going to depend on what style the game is and what content was cut before it was released and what content could be added in later. So overall, I think that director's cuts are an interesting concept, and I think that there is definitely room for them in the industry as long as they aren't misused. So let me explain. I think that as long as director's cuts are additive content to original games, they will be accepted and they will be great additions. I think that it will give diehard fans of the original game an excuse to go back and replay the experience, and it will be more polished and have more content, and I think that's great. I also think that it, on the other side, will create a good dynamic for people who maybe aren't the biggest fans of some of these bigger games. So for example, if you're not the biggest fan of Ghost of Tsushima, then you can just get the standard version where you don't have 8 hours of extra content or whatever it is, and you'll have a more streamlined version of the game. In fact, I think that there could be a market for games like The Last of Us 2 or Red Dead Redemption 2 that are incredibly long games. I think that if there were perhaps more shortened, streamlined versions of the games for cheaper, there would be a market for them. The greatest danger when it comes to director's cuts, in my opinion, is the possibility that a publisher could subtract content from the original game and save it for the director's cut. So let's say that EA, for example, who in the past have been known to make arguably anti-consumer decisions, goes to Respawn, who is likely developing Jedi Fallen Order 2 right now, and let's say that they tell Respawn, we're going to take 3 hours out of your game, we're going to take these 3 worlds that you can explore out of the game, we're going to take these 2 force abilities and these 2 lightsaber colors out of the customization for your game, and we're going to save those for the director's cut. Now, what I think would happen is you have the original game, which would still be priced at $70, but it wouldn't feel like a complete package. And then you would have EA come out and say, if you want the full Jedi Fallen Order experience, the full director's cut, you're going to have to come out and pay an additional $20 for things that just should have been originally in the game. So I think that the best way of summarizing that is, as long as the content is additive and wasn't essential to the initial release of the game, I think that director's cuts are fine. And again, I think that standard cuts are also an interesting market, and I think that there would be an audience for them. I look at games like Assassin's Creed Valhalla. If there was a shorter, more streamlined version of the game, that's the one that I personally would have bought. So it is an interesting dynamic, and it is something that I do think could shift a little bit in the games industry going forward, if there is a shorter and a longer version of different games. Now, ultimately, I think, again, that there are a lot of great opportunities and ideas here. However, I also think that perhaps they are choosing the wrong games to give director's cuts. Not because Ghost of Tsushima and Death Stranding are not good games, because they absolutely are. It's not because I think that they don't deserve one at some point. It's that I think that the releases are so new that it almost makes people who just dropped $60 on a game like Ghost of Tsushima feel like perhaps they wasted their money, as the product is now not the complete or polished version. I think that director's cuts should be more looked at for games that are around a decade or more old. For example, yes, the Ghost of Tsushima director's cut, the Death Stranding director's cuts, they did turn heads, but imagine if a director's cut had been announced for Batman Arkham Asylum or BioShock or something like that. And you look at a game like Resident Evil 2 Remake, and if more games got that kind of treatment, just with additional content and story beats, I do feel that there would perhaps be more hype for that and a little bit more potential. A lot of those games removed content because of the technological restrictions, and a lot of that content could now be reintroduced. It's an interesting era for sure in the games industry, and I think that there are a lot of great new types of products, again, remasters, director's cuts, remakes, that are being pushed out. And I think that a lot of them could be combined. So again, if there was a BioShock remake director's cut that was 2 hours longer than the original game, and where the shooting mechanics were more refined, I think that there would be a massive audience for that, and it arguably wouldn't be a huge investment, as that game could be remade with a smaller team these days, as opposed to something like Ghost of Tsushima, where you have to have Sucker Punch the entire crew work on additional content for this game, when fans in a lot of ways probably would rather they be working on the sequel. So ultimately, there's a lot of different dynamics, there's a lot of interesting directions that this could go, but ultimately I don't think that director's cuts are inherently bad, as long as publishers don't get greedy and start subtracting content rather than simply adding it for the director's cut. But thanks you guys so much for watching. Please be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Let me know in the comments below what you think about director's cuts. Are there any upcoming director's cuts that you're interested in getting? What game do you think should get a director's cut? Again, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one.